in the 1950s, and Neil too fell under its spell. He listened to the likes of Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers, and of course, Elvis Presley. And Neil would eventually get to see Elvis covering his songs.
You can definitely hear the Elvis influence. The way he sings, the drama that he brings to it. Later on, you can see it in the outfits. For most kids growing up in the 50s and 60s, Elvis was a pretty significant force.
In the 70s, Elvis Presley covered Neil Diamond's Crackling Rosie and Grass Don't Pay No Mind. And Elvis played Las Vegas in the early 70s, and Neil Diamond got to see him. Elvis, as was his way, introduced the celebrities in the audience when he played Las Vegas. And of course, he introduced Neil Diamond, who gave him these two fantastic songs to sing. Neil Diamond, being Neil Diamond, got up very reluctantly. The crowd chanted for Neil Diamond to go up on stage and duet with Elvis. And Elvis, being the showman that he was, naturally encouraged such a thing. Neil Diamond, always self-conscious, always unsure of himself, refused to do it. And talking about it years later, he still was unrepentant that it was the right thing to do not to duet with Elvis.
After dropping out of medical school, Neil was picked up by a succession of songwriting teams and labels. It would be his time at New York's Brill Building that would help Neil hone his craft.
When you look at all the artists that have been through the Brill Building, the Shirelles, Burt Bacharach, Carole King, it was just this incredible hotbed of songwriting talent, and Neil Diamond went straight into the middle of it.
Carole King, who's another Brill Building alumni, talks a lot about it. She said that there are these tiny little rooms that you sat in, and the walls were pretty thin, so you could hear what other people were doing. And the way Carole King describes it, you'd hear someone coming up with something great. So A, you might steal a little bit of it, but B, you felt, I'd better do something good myself by 5 o'clock, when the song publisher comes around and sees if I've got anything. So I think that was a very, very significant time.
This was the perfect place where even someone as awkward as him could network and become known. He used the Brill Building to further his own career. And I don't mean that cynically at all. It was a brilliant thing to do.
Neil wrote songs covered by the likes of Deep Purple, Cliff Richard, and Lulu, but he would become best known for writing songs popularized by the Monkees. In 1968, Neil signed a deal with MCA Records, and with the confidence of his songwriting background, began releasing his own material.
Baby loves me, yes, yes she does.
Cherry Cherry is a great song. It could have been for the Monkees. It's one of those just brilliant bubblegum pop songs. It's got everything I love about the kind of Phil Spector style. It's quite innocent. It's quite cartoonish. But there's something very cool about it at the same time.
He was becoming reasonably well known as a performer, not just as the guy who wrote I'm a Believer, who was taking a chance on his own solo career.
Although only a moderate success when first released, Neil's fourth album, Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show, would prove to be his breakthrough.
Brothers, when you're on the hardest trouble, when you're on the hardest, moving the fears and the frustrations of the day, you got to take...
Brother Love's Travelling Salvation show was an indication that Neil Diamond wasn't kind of bound by his pop roots or even his singer-songwriter pretensions, that he would take chances and that he would move into different areas. And this embraced that old-style Southern gospel. It's a real surprise to hear someone do it. It stands out now as an oddity in his performances.
The single Sweet Caroline, released in 1969, was so popular that it was added to the album and made Neil a worldwide name.
Sweet Caroline is just one of those really magical songs that has this funny effect on people. All around the world, it's been adopted by sports fans as this song they sing. I've definitely been down the pub and heard people suddenly start kind of singing it. It's just one of those songs, it's like an anthem.
Sweet Caroline was the song which transformed his career. It was a crossover song for him. It showed that he wasn't just going to be an albums artist, that he was going to be a singles artist too.
Sweet Caroline, good time never seemed so good.
It's really stood the test of time. It's been covered by everyone from Frank Sinatra to Roy Orbison to the Jonas Brothers, so it's definitely got that magic something.
Sweet Caroline.
The next year, Neil released Taproot Manuscript. The album featured a side inspired by African rhythm. His label was initially worried about the commercial viability of the release, but it went on to be his biggest success up until that point in his career.
Come here, come see.
In 1970, Neil Diamond released Taproot Manuscript, which was a record that explored African rhythms and brought in a whole new host of influences, which was really pretty groundbreaking at the time.
It's incredibly experimental and interesting, and actually it's got a lot of African and world music influences. A long time before people like Peter Gabriel were investigating those music and co-opting them into what they were doing.
Shall provide.
You don't really expect someone like Neil Diamond to be experimenting. You think of him as a very mainstream performer, really, but he was. He was trying out different things. You know, this is a long time before other Western pop singers were employing African music. It wasn't happening. So I think he deserves some credit for that.
In 1972, Neil Diamond recorded Moods. It was a departure in sound for him yet again, but one that he would stay with until the 1990s.
Song sung blue.
1972's Moods is the defining album of Neil Diamond's early, mid-70s career. It has Song Sung Blue on it, and it has the things which came to characterise Neil Diamond: the seriousness, the slightly overwrought production, this voice.
But when you take the blues and make a song.
It was definitely a shift in sound to what would become probably known as the archetypal Neil Diamond sound. A lot of the people who were fans of his earlier stuff might have balked a little bit because it was a little bit more mainstream and the pomp and the circumstance that came in. But it's a record that defines what Neil Diamond is.
Good Lord!
The same year, Neil performed a sold-out concert at the Greek Theatre, Los Angeles. The songwriter proved himself as an electric live entertainer.
In 1972, Neil Diamond released a live album called Hot August Night, which was a runaway success. At the time, a lot of bands were bringing out live records because it was this kind of new thing, and so people were getting very excited about that. But also, Neil Diamond really showcased his skill as a live performer. He was very charismatic, he liked to play to the crowd, and that translated really well at those shows at the Greek Theatre.
In the live setting, he's just a consummate entertainer and a performer. And that really comes across on that record, and I think The fact that a live album is one of his most successful is a testament to his performances.
Along with a growing reputation for his live performances, Neil was also becoming known for his extravagant shirts.
Elton John has his glasses, and I think it's good for performers to have their thing. Johnny Cash was the man in black. Neil Diamond's got the loud shirts, and maybe they kind of bring out his eyes or something, I don't know.
Sometimes it's almost hard to reconcile Neil Diamond's croonery side to his stage attire. So he is very, very famous for choosing these shirts that are bedazzled in every single way. You know, they have sequins on them, or they've got beading, or they've got applique, or they're plunging so you can see his furry chest, you know. And he said it was because he wanted audience members who were way, way back in the cheap seats to be able to see him without squinting.
Neil Diamond's association with cinema in his career introduced him to new audiences. His soundtrack to the film Jonathan Livingston Seagull grossed more than the film itself.
And make your song be heard.
It was when you had the 60s, but it was really only the kind of, you know, I guess only the fashionable people were part of the 60s. And by the 70s, everyone was soul-searching and being introspective and, you know, had a Buddha in their mantelpiece or whatever. And I think he was giving a certain kind of enlightenment-seeking soundtrack for suburbia.
Just as the author, Richard Bach, didn't like the film, he didn't like the soundtrack either. And even by Neil Diamond's standards, it was a torturous recording process. There were songs which were left off the album which appeared later, which weren't finished in time. Part of the reason why it was so late wasn't because he wasn't working hard, but because he was spending months studying Hare Krishna and similar Eastern religion in order to understand this frankly silly tale about a seagull.
It used to be so natural. Talk about
A former classmate of Neil's had her own success in music and film since leaving Erasmus Hall High School. Barbra Streisand teamed up with Neil for the song You Don't Bring Me Flowers, although it was never initially planned to be a duet.
He initially wrote this song as the intro sequence to a sitcom. Neil Diamond ended up expanding the jingle into a full-blown song. The following year, Barbra Streisand decided to record the song. And then an enterprising DJ from Kentucky decided to splice these two versions together. This duet was so popular that it actually forced Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand to go into the studio properly and create this huge song.
Kind of tenderness to it, and I think it works. I think it's quite honest in its own way.
After the success of the song, there were plans for Neil and Barbra to star in a film together based on the track, but Neil declined after he was offered the chance to star in a remake of The Jazz Singer. Although, once again, Neil's soundtrack to the film would be vastly more successful than the film itself.
Don't let all my years in show business throw you. I'm a nervous wreck about this.
They'll love you.
The Jazz Singer was a huge misfire for him to do at that stage. I mean, just purely in simple terms, he was much, much too old to be playing the role of a kind of rookie on the run from New York, rebelling against his parents and going to LA to be a star. Miraculously, within about 30 seconds of showing up in LA, he is offered huge amounts of money to become a star. And the whole thing is completely implausible and ridiculous.
summer love. They call it summer love.
He was supposed to be playing this guy who was breaking away from his father and going his own way and exploring his own life, but actually at the time, Neil Diamond was like 40, so it kind of didn't really read that he was having this tussle with Laurence Olivier, who played his dad. I mean, the whole thing was just very, very surreal.
But I was a lonely boy.
It's not a good performance, he's not a good actor. He seems like a pop star being himself, more than anything. And there's a lot of things in that film that don't make sense. I mean, he's meant to be, all the themes are very adolescent, you know, about his breaking away from his father and all this stuff, but the guy's too old. You know, he's already been a massively successful star, and you can see it on his face.
The 80s saw Neil struggle, but cinema once again played a part in his career when director Quentin Tarantino chose a Neil Diamond composition, Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon, for the soundtrack to his hit film, Pulp Fiction.
I love you so much, can't count all the ways I died for you, girl, and all they can say is he's not your kind.
Quentin Tarantino is very good at choosing soundtracks and reinventing, in the way that he reinvents actors almost, as he did with John Travolta. The soundtrack can reinvent musicians. So although the cover version by Urge Overkill was a semi-ironic tribute to Neil Diamond, it put him into a new light, and I think it probably brought, to an extent, a new audience.
It showed how rich his back catalogue is. It showed that underneath the hits, bubbling under the surface, are a selection of great songs throughout the decades.
I actually find it astonishing that Neil Diamond wrote Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon, because I think a lot of his songs lack that kind of sexy, sultry factor, and that song really has it, and is absolutely my favorite Neil Diamond song.
It's a song, yet again, that was taken by a band and propelled to huge status, and he's kind of the man in the background who's written the song that people don't know about, but then discover. So that kind of was a theme for him, I guess, in his career.
Neil's renaissance continued as he went into the studio with producer Rick Rubin. Surprisingly, for an artist that has sold over 92 million albums worldwide, the resulting Home Before Dark became his first to reach #1 on the Billboard chart.
Is what you showed me. Pretty amazing grace is who you are.
It was a revelation. These are the albums which has pushed Neil Diamond into the ranks of the greats. They showed how brilliant he was, and the songs, they were so clear.
Pretty amazing grace is how you saved me.
There's a song in there called Hell Yeah. It's about mortality, and it's a message to his family about all the things that he'd done in his life. Real tender, beautiful songs that he eked out of him and just kept getting him to write and write and rewrite until he felt like he was saying something that he wanted to be saying as a man in that period of his life.
You forgave my insensitivity and my attempt to then mislead you.
I think the reason that album works so well is because of this idea that he stripped away the excesses of showbiz, which looked great probably in the mid-70s, but definitely by the early 2000s was beginning to look a bit tawdry. And Rick Rubin took that away.
Stumbled inside the doorway of your chapel.
Off the back of these Rick Rubin produced albums, Neil Diamond then went on to play Glastonbury in 2008, and his performance was a real treat.
They were so clearly and Spartanly produced that they had to stand on their own merits without virtually any arrangement. And a new generation discovered Neil Diamond and realised what an artist he can be.
Move up the road to the outside of town and the sound of that good gospel beat.
He's released 48 albums, which is just incredible to get your head around, especially with the rate that musicians produce albums these days.
And that gospel group telling you and me it's love, brother, love, said brother, love, coming in salvation sure.
I like that gritty side to him. I like hearing the rawness. And I think there's something interesting as well about an artist of a certain age, looking back over his life. He's just left classic American songs. And I think He's tried different things throughout his career and kept trying and keeps trying, and I just think that's kind of an amazing kind of legacy to leave, really.
Bet you could hear yourself sweat.
He's left this incredible body of work for reasons I've never been able to comprehend. People ridicule him and take him as a lightweight. He isn't. He's a heavyweight songwriter. He's a great songwriter. He's a fantastic singer. Just go and listen to the things beyond the hits, and then you will see what his legacy is.